the ones who are here. It's good to have you here. The day is carrying on. Now, to link together the things that we've already discussed, we have talked about zero trust. We've tried to go into the explaining what isolation and segmentation is and how to break out of this. And we've barely touched a little bit upon industrial control systems, not from this perspective as our next speaker is going to present. Now, I have on stage Casper and, well, the crowd, both here and online, is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. B. I've been looking forward to this opportunity for a long time. My name is Casper Bladt, and I'm a senior IT/OT cybersecurity consultant with the company called ICS Range. ICS Range is an online interactive industrial control system security training platform. That was a long sentence. In the past, I've been doing control systems for industrial refrigeration and embedded controllers for C and C++. Parallel to that, I've been competing in different hacking competitions, like in 2016, where I qualified for the Danish Defense Intelligence Services Hacker Academy, and later for the National Hacking Team's semi-final in 18 and 19. I'm going to start with a quick overview of some of the aberrations I'm going to use in this presentation. IT, or informational technology, we all know. What I understand with IT is enterprise systems that handles data instead of processes and physical stuff. It handles data, information, users, and permissions. Some say that operational technology means, some say that OT means operational technology, but I don't agree. I say it means overtime, but there we are. That interacts with the real world and processes instead. That could be like robots controlling the storage facilities in industrial or commercial contexts. It could be conveyor bands in a factory, or it could be the industrial refrigeration plants that I talked about just before. Then there's the magic aberration called ICS that are used a bit so and so. Industrial control system, it means, and with that I mean the actual PLCs or controllers or modules that sits on the actual plant controlling the refrigeration cycle, as an example, or controlling the motor that runs the conveyor band, or controlling the actuators in the arm in the robot that in the before mentioned storage facility. Here's a quote which again just highlights what I just tried to say just before. The difference between enterprise security and ICS security is the data in the servers and the facility to safely and securely operate whatever this industry or commercial thing is doing. What I'm here to talk about is this device. It's called a Moxa NPort 5110. It's a so-called serial device server, which purpose in life is to connect to these PLCs or controllers or RTUs or whatever that could exist in these ICS plants. It could connect to these devices, uses different serial buses as RS-232, 485, and even some of them can do 422. On the other side, it will do Ethernet in any way, RJ45, fiber, some still uses M12. But the thing is that they connect to an IP network. So you through an IP tunnel, so to say, you can connect to this serial device, and that serial COM port will actually show up on your Windows PC as if you were physically connected to it with the serial adapter. We in ICS Range have been testing this device a lot the last half year or so, and there's a few reasons for that. One of them is that there's a lot of them in use around the world, especially in Europe, where they are in use in everything from refrigeration plants, power plants, wind turbines, and all sorts of other stuff that that exists. My colleague, he usually says that that either you know that you have Moxa devices in your network, or you don't know what you have in your network. 6,174 is publicly available on the internet, according to Shodan. And to IT people, that might not seem like a lot. Like if you were to look up some Cisco device or something related on Shodan, you would get way more results. But in this world, that is really much. And when you're comparing to some of Moxa's competition on the market in serial device servers, they get like 30 hits, or one of them got even 1,500 hits. So it's still way less than Moxa. The thing is that this number should be 0, because all of these should be hidden from the internet. They shouldn't be directly accessible from the internet, and that is one of the things I will get into in a bit. I'm going to talk a bit about an attack on the Ukrainian power grid in 2015. This slide might seem a bit familiar to some of you, because it looks a lot like the one that were presented in the presentation just before me. So I'm gonna try to just fill in what else I had to say about it. This whole attack was a combination of a lot of different attack vectors. One of them was a ransomware attack that Russia launched on Ukraine. Meanwhile, they launched some denial of service, distributed denial of service attacks on call centers and TV stations, while they deployed an attack on these Moxa NPort devices using a configuration leak in them. So they could access these Moxa devices. I don't know if it was directly on the internet or they had some kind of internal access, but they could access them via IP network. From a bug in the Moxa firmware, they could, through SNMP, they could leak the whole configuration wherein the administrator password were in clear text. With this clear text password, they could, using the Windows tool that Moxa supplies, they could log in to the device, they could attach the serial COM port to their computer, and they could take control on whatever was in the other end of that serial connection. In this case, it were some IEC 104 controlled breakers, or like big relays that were actually controlling substations in this power grid. So they could actually just turn off substations one by one, and all in all, about 250,000 people in Kiev were without power for over the Christmas. An interesting thing about this power grid attack is that it is the first publicly acknowledged cyber attack on a whole nation's, like, state-sponsored attack on a nation's power grid. That is one of the reasons that we chose to test this Moxa device. It's also that we wanted to use it for educational purposes. Again, ICS range, we do interactive training in ICS security. And we thought that with these previous attacks on the device, which were disclosed, and there were proof of concepts publicly available, and it seemed easy that we could take some of these attacks and use them for educational purposes. But instead, we found our own few vulnerabilities in this device. So there are two I'm going to mention here. There's a buffer overflow one, which we so far have succeeded in using as a denial of service attack, which means that we can, from remote, we can turn off the device, which would practically mean that the 6,100 and so much devices that we saw earlier that were all online on the internet, we would be able to turn off with a simple script. I'm sure that there will be some people out there who wouldn't appreciate that. There's also a so-called out-of-bounds write vulnerability, which is still in responsible disclosure. I'm not going to talk much about that, but that is also basically just a denial of service vulnerability, which allows you to write to more or less arbitrary pieces of memory around the device. The device's processor memory. Then I promised our dear Dr. B that I would provide some extra spice for this presentation that I haven't talked about before. And the thing is that a few weeks ago we realized, my colleague Jens realized that the attack that the Russians leveraged in the power grid attack in 2015, which enabled them to leak the whole configuration, it were never fully patched. They removed the clear text password from the configuration, but you are still able to leak the rest of the configuration, like the private SNMP community string. And that is just as bad as the password, really, because you can also use that to set values here and there. Buffer overflow is the vulnerability I'm going to talk a bit about. As I said, we have proved this to be a denial of service vulnerability, which means, again, that we can power the device off. But hypothetically, we could use this to run our own code on the Moxa device. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we could maybe do that. This is how the memory looks like, the stack memory looks like in the CPU of such a little ARM processor that is running in a Moxa NPort device. Basically, we have on the left we have a block for local storage and the parameters in the current function that we are running in. From that function, we are going to call another function, like imagine plain C code where you are just calling a function. What ARM 32-bit would do as the very first thing is that it would save some of the CPU registers on the stack in the memory so it could pop them back again later. The registers that are saved are, among others, the linked register, which is very interesting. I'm going to talk a bit about. There's the frame pointer and a bunch of other registers. And then we get to the new function's own local storage, and the stack grows further down. If that function were to call a new function, then we could take this whole block and copy on again. The linked register is the address in memory of where we are supposed to jump back when we are done executing this second function. In Intel architecture, this is typically called return pointer, and it means the same. So what we do is that we start with putting the current instruction pointer on the stack, calling the link register. We continue downwards and continue executing. Where it gets interesting is that with this buffer overflow vulnerability, is that we on this local storage would have a small, in this case, too small buffer allocated, stack allocated buffer, which we can read into with no limits on how much data we can read into it. So let's say this buffer has 10 bytes allocated, but we are able to write 2000 bytes into it. Then we would just override, you can see my mouse, we would just override up through all these registers and write whatever we wanted in them. So if we were to just override them with junk, then as soon as this function is done executing, we would jump down to the saved linked register, which could maybe just be a bunch of the character A, and then the CPU would say, this address doesn't exist, and then it would die. Any embedded software developer would then say, but wouldn't there be some kind of watchdog mechanism in the CPU that would take care of this, that would say, oh, now the device has been dead for so long, now I'm gonna power cycle it. I would say so too, but that's apparently not the case. This is a bit more explicit what I was trying to explain. If we imagine the C code here, we allocate a char buffer on the stack, and then we read in from console input into this buffer, and then we read 256 bytes, whereas there only were 10 allocated, and therefore we could just override up until we hit something we shouldn't. In this case, on this Moxa NPort device, this is done through a TCP socket through its web server, actually. So basically, if you just send a web request to it that is too long, then it will die. It's that simple, actually. This buffer overflow vulnerability could potentially be used to arbitrary code execution, which again means that we could execute our own assembly code on this embedded device. To bring an example of that, which is not running on the Moxa, but is running on my PC, I'm going to bring in these series of online challenges that anyone can go download called ROP Emporium. ROP is the technique. It's called return-oriented programming. And this is the first of the tasks, which basically just says there's a buffer overflow, leverage it so you can call some specified function that we want you to. And then in this case, instead of dying and some industrial refrigeration plant would blow up, it will print out a flag on the screen that I then could go back and submit for points, like in the CTF that is running right now. So this ROP Emporium challenge just gives us a binary executable file compiled with ARM 32-bit. I'm here using some Python code. It's on purpose that you can't really see all of it. Basically, I'm using the library called Pwn Tools to send some data to the binary executable, and then to take control over it. Yeah, I have a short demo of that. Everybody can see. This is the binary executable that I just mentioned, and this is the solve script. The interesting thing about this binary is that it contains a function called ret or return to win, and that is what the challenge description says, that you should take control over the execution flow, so you can call that function, and then you will get the flag printed out. So if I were to call this binary, and this binary is actually compiled with ARM 32-bit, it's just that I have some magic installed on my computer, so it will automatically run in a virtualized environment. It will write some text message to us, some silly, goofy stuff that these challenges usually rely on, and we can write something to it, and it will say thank you, and it will exit. The solve script that I quickly showed in my PowerPoint is the same as I have here. Basically, we have a buffer here that we fill up with the character A, that we can compare to the situation here, where we fill up the registers until we hit the saved linked register, which we then fill up with the address of the function called ret to win. So if I were to execute this solve script, it will again say silly goofy stuff, and we can then see how this A character is sent X amount of times, then the address of the function that we want to call, and then instead of just saying thank you, exit, it says well done, here's your flag. That is the basic principle of return-oriented programming. And this is a very basic example, but it's actually a really fun way to get into this kind of stuff. Okay. A fun thing to note is that the first time this kind of, they call it stack smashing instead of buffer overflow. The first time it was described in a white paper, a technical paper, was in '96. The paper is called Smashing the Stack for Fun and Profit. It's publicly available. The paper is 2 years older than I am, and still we see these kind of vulnerabilities, very simple vulnerabilities that anyone who is experienced in developing C code or C++ code should by now know how to handle. But here we are. Yes, talk is cheap. I have a video that would demonstrate the buffer overflow vulnerability, and I hope that the video on a video stream on a video will work. So basically, on the bottom right corner, we have the Moxa NPort device, and we have my colleague Jens' very, very tidy disk. On the top right, there's the Windows tool that Moxa provides to help configure and use these Moxa NPort devices. And on the left side, he is now going to demonstrate how the web interface works, and that he can go retrieve all data that might or might not be relevant right now, but yeah. Again, the website still works. Now there's a proof of concept script he's running at it, which is still classified, unfortunately. He runs it at the target, and immediately you would see that the small light here dies. Very difficult to see, I think, up on the big screen. Okay. What we would then learn is that it should be down now. Yes, the web server wouldn't respond anymore, and it will not respond to a ping message anymore. That's all it took, running that simple Python script that I wish I could show you. Potential impact of this buffer overflow or denial of service vulnerabilities. In the IT world, those kind of denial of service vulnerabilities are not worth that much, simply because that you have high availability, or you have redundancy, or you have methods for easily patching your software or IT stuff. The thing is that in the industrial world, this means the world. It means a lot, because these plants, industrial plants, again, refrigeration plants, power grid, substations, anything, they are not necessarily high available on these kind of Moxa serial device servers. If you take one down, then you lose access to the plant. And what would happen then? Yeah, I can't talk for sure about every industrial plant, but a lot of those that I have seen, they have these kind of fail-safe mechanisms that simply does so that when they can't communicate with the controllers in the plant anymore, they, for safety reasons, simply have to shut it down. Because if they don't know what's going on, they don't know what kind of alarms and warnings and information is being sent back and forth, they'll shut it down. And so in that way, a simple too long web request for a Moxa device can shut down, potentially shut down a whole substation for a power grid, taking out electricity for very many people. The fun thing is that the last time I gave this talk and I said this exact sentence, the power actually went, and everybody was like, what is the Russians? And it wasn't, it was a breaker in the cupboard, but yeah, it was funny. Procedure of how we took apart this device. We started with some physical enumeration, we call it, of this device, which means take the lid off of it and look at it. We quickly learned that the processor, the CPU chip itself, microcontroller chip, it is some kind of rebranded chip. Probably it is an ARM chip, we know that, but it is a rebranded chip, which means that we do not know what exact ARM chip it is, and therefore we can't just Google our way to the pinout, like which pin is what. Because if we were able to, then we could potentially be able to attach some debugging mechanism to this chip, and then it would be much easier to leverage this buffer overflow vulnerability into actual arbitrary code execution. We didn't get that far. Also, we were looking for control ports on the device, like if the device itself could print out some status messages or some log messages or something, but it didn't seem like there were any UART or RS-232 or something like that available. A thing worth mentioning is also that, of course, we went to Moxa's website and downloaded all the firmwares for it that we could get. And we noticed that the newer ones, they are all encrypted, but the older ones, they are not. So we started finding out where they started being encrypted, at what firmware version they stopped being unencrypted, start being encrypted. And rightly enough, my colleague Jens were at the last unencrypted version. That one contained a key for decrypting the encrypted versions. So yeah, if you just downloaded the newest encrypted version, then you wouldn't be able to unencrypt. But if you just did it in the right order, then you had the key, and then we could decrypt the newest versions also. We didn't find much exciting stuff in the firmware. Actually, they had used these mechanisms on the binary executables, like they have so-called stripped the binaries for any fancy symbols that we could leverage, and it just makes it hard to do some statistical analysis that would help us doing the arbitrary code execution. Then we went on to enumerating it on the network side, and it had a bunch of open services like SNMP. We could dump a whole lot of information that, yeah, there were information, but not really anything that we could attack it with. There were some other different services, like their own TCP thingy, where you can connect through the Windows tool, so you could tunnel the COM-port, which is the basic principle of the Moxa NPort. No, what we actually started with was the HTTP server, because it was just the easiest place to start. And my colleague Jens, as I've mentioned him a few times, he took care of that part. And it was really funny to watch, because he took his best IT hacking skill set and began attacking this web server from back and forth and everything, and quickly realized that it wasn't like a known web server that you could go and download from GitHub or buy or whatever. It was their own they had developed, but he couldn't really find anything interesting, and just he got more and more frustrated until at the last he just sent it a whole lot of A's to it, and then it died. Yeah. We were ready to report these vulnerabilities in March this year, and following that were long-winded and annoying and, yeah, heavy discussions about when and where and CVSS score, and then ICS CERT in USA said, this is the CVSS score, and then Moxa said, no, it's not. And then, but we ended up finding a middle way of, I think it achieved 7.5, and a patch was released, and Moxa, they released an advisory, published an advisory. What do we do now? Maybe some of you are sitting there thinking, oh God, I have 84,000 Moxa NPorts in my network at home, not at home, at my workplace. What do I do? The thing is that Moxa has made a patch for this, but they have also made it so that you need to have a valid guarantee evidence for these Moxa devices, and then you have to, by yourself, go to the technical support and ask for this patch. And I'm pretty sure that the reason they did it that way were that they were getting pretty tired of me and Jens just taking their stuff apart. So if any one of you do have this evidence of guarantee and are willing to go get the patch, then my email will be in the last slide. Another thing that could be done is that we have PCAP files where we have captured the malicious traffic, Those could be used to instrument advanced firewalls, EDS systems, to drop these malicious packets before reaching the endport device. And finally, the HTTP service can be disabled altogether. It can be using the Windows tool that Moxa provides, where you can also do the basic configuring. Also, more spicy stuff for Dr. B, as promised. Recently, we found a vulnerability where we, on a whole series of Moxa, I think they're called universal communicator, we could simply bypass the root authentication altogether when we are physically connected to the device. That is an interesting one, because how do you rate that? Because it is only available when you are physically connected to the device and not over remote. And that was also a topic for long-winded discussions with Moxa, if that is a problem or not. And I can kind of see the point that if you can't leverage from remote, then what can you use it for? But I still don't think it is a good idea that you can go to this, which is basically just a small Linux computer, and then you can do it just and then you can log in as root. That is all that I had to say.
Perfect, thank you. All right, well, let's have a chat.
Let's have a chat.
Let's have a chat. So, why on earth did you look at this device? Was that the one that you just picked up from the box, or just the Moxa device, or someone just told you, hey, look at this device, there might be something vulnerable in there?
You know the answer to that, don't you?
I do, but please tell me.
The thing is that my boss, Mikael, and Bernhard, they know each other, and therefore Bernhard also knows that Mikael has this thing for these Moxa devices, and it was him that basically took a bunch of them and threw in the back of me.
So yeah, something just lying around, right?
Yeah, something just lying around. But no, it is a really interesting device, and as I said earlier, the whole leveraged in the Russia-Ukrainian war and other types of attacks, it is used everywhere. We have multiple customers who use them, and they're used everywhere, and it was actually really interesting.
Right. Now, no matter how we might downplay the denial of service attack here, in ICS networks, denial of service is quite important, because everything is there, not primarily, well, it's more availability that matters here. Now, in your talk, you tried to mention also the remote code execution as well. Now, how would you approach now the Moxa device? Because I know that the industrial control systems are not famous for having, I don't know, good security measures in place like memory protection, randomization. Specifically, if you're looking at the hardware and doing hardware debugging, that is really a very huge pain to connect and see what now happens in the memory of the device. Is there anything that you've tried to figure out on? If not, what would you think, what would be the next steps that you might pursue, regardless if you're going to do this or not?
Well, the next steps would be to do some extra investigation in what is it actually, the chip, the MCU that are in the device, what is it actually, which model is it actually? And from there you could find out the pinout, which pin goes where, and from that you could figure out where to attach your debugger. That is the first step. When you have your debugger attached, you also need to know where to stop the debugger, where to break the debugger, and everything. And maybe, depending on how the debugging pins are configured or not configured, you can dump the whole memory from the MCU via the debugging line, the JTAG perhaps, or you would need to statically analyze the kind of encrypted firmware that you download from Moxa's website.
Right, so also getting the firmware itself and analyzing the firmware would be part of the process.
It would be
either
crucial,
either
yeah.
reading the firmware off from the chip or downloading the latest firmware update or whatever there is. How easy would it be to read the firmware and actually analyze it afterwards? Not always you would understand what the developers have intended there, but you have a developer background and you have engineering background as well. Would you say that reading the firmware and reverse engineering, or at least figuring out the key aspects, would be relatively straightforward, or that will take a lot of time to process?
I don't think straightforward is the right word or expression. But depending on how, well, typically that kind of ARM chip would have a so-called JTAG interface, which is a bunch of pins on where you can attach this debugging mechanism, where you can step and stop and break in the code and see what's going on. Through that interface, you would also be able to read what is currently lying in the flash or the memory of the MCU. By MCU, I mean microcontroller unit, and that you would need to analyze from top to bottom. And yes, that would not necessarily be the easiest or most fun thing in the world.
Absolutely. Unless someone is experiencing sleepless nights and just tries to find some cure for sleep, and then just reading the code might be the one. Now, please do tell us, if you can, about your experience with working with a vendor, and if you engaged any other party there while doing the vulnerability disclosure process. As much as you can, please, just how did you feel in this process?
Okay. As I tried to say earlier, it was a really, at least compared to IT, where you sometimes have a patch ready in a few hours for a critical vulnerability, then 4 months is a really long time. And me and Jens, we were getting really tired of it. But the other day when I was preparing this presentation, I actually found a hint to why they didn't really like us that much. And that is in is my screen still shared? In the video that we sent Moxa along the proof of concept, there's this line: NPort should be slowly corrupting its own memory. Now we need to give it 30 seconds to fuck itself up a bit. I'm just not sure that Moxa appreciated that.
Yeah, you tried to be very direct and very blunt there. In the meantime, are there any questions from the audience? There is one question, please. Let's take it from the audience as well.
Thank you for your great presentation. It was very interesting. I know many have slept, but I think from my perspective, it was very interesting, and I know that it's a heavy job under there. My question, have you found any ways to harden device? Because in cases where you cannot patch them, you try to harden, and that's how you mitigate the problem.
Well, in the ICS world, the vendor's answer to that question is always the same: put a firewall in front of it. And yeah, then the best bet I have right now is to either get the patch. Okay, my screen is not that, doesn't matter. Either get the patch from Moxa or disable the HTTP service. That would be my way of hardening it. Does that answer the? Yeah.
Right. I guess one of the key recommendations specifically in the OT networks is disable the services that you do not use, or enable them only once you require them. I would guess like there would be no need for constant configuration of that device. You configure it pretty much once, deploy it in the network, and you can safely disable the web interface. Would that be applicable here as well?
Well, I can't see a reason why not, but maybe somebody has a better perspective out there.
Right, and one of the things that you're also doing is the ICS range. Now, for trainings, how well can you deploy the hardware and scalable hardware for the training to be given to the students within the ICS and OT world?
Okay, so the idea behind the ICS range is that you get remote access to a bunch of ICS-related equipment, which you and then you get presented with some material along with some challenges, very CTF style, and then you get to hack the equipment, retrieve the flags, submit the flags for points, and then you can compete with your colleagues that way. The challenge is then that if you have, let's just say, 48,000 people trying to hack the same Moxa device at the same time to retrieve a flag to submit on the page, then something wouldn't work. Somebody would need to, you need to hire somebody to sit in the data center to sit and power cycle the device every time somebody killed it, and I'm not sure that would be good way to handle it. What we have done instead with this kind of problems is that we have written some C code to virtualize a problem or vulnerability very much like the one actually described in the CVE or whatever we refer to, and then simply letting the student hack the virtualized environment instead of the actual physical one.
Right.
Combined with the actual physical equipment for where that makes sense.
All right, so a final question from my side, as long as there's no questions here, raised hands, is what is the next device that you're going to pick out from the box?
Who says we're done with this one?
Ah, okay, perfect answer. With this, I thank Casper for the talk, and a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.